There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look the way people expect loneliness to look. It lives quietly inside a man who still mows his own lawn, who still dresses properly before leaving the house, who still says he is fine when the neighbors ask and means it. Mostly because he has long since stopped measuring his life against what it used to be. He has accepted the silence. He has made his peace with it. He does not complain. That is the loneliness that nobody rescues you from, because you stop looking like you need rescuing. Harold Eugene Watkins was 88 years old. He had survived a war, buried a wife, outlived two of his closest friends, and raised a family that had scattered across the country the way families do. He was not unhappy. He was simply alone in the way that good, steady men become alone when the world keeps moving and they stay exactly where they always were. He had no idea. On the Tuesday morning, his granddaughter drove him to the Family Feud studio in Atlanta that the people who loved him most had spent 6 weeks arranging the most carefully kept secret of his life. He had no idea that when Steve Harvey looked at him across that stage and said two words, "Look again," the room would go so quiet that people in the back row said they could hear him breathing. This is what happened, and this is why it mattered. Harold Watkins was born in 1936 in Macon, Georgia, the third of 5 children in a family that had very little money and a great deal of dignity. His father worked for the railroad. His mother took in ironing and sewing and ran their household, with the precision of a woman who understood that precision was what stood between her family and chaos. Harold grew up understanding that you showed up, you did your work, you did not make yourself a burden, and you expressed love through presence rather than words, because words were something you had to be careful with, and presence never ran out. He served in the Korean War at 17, lying about his age at the recruitment office, with the calm confidence of a boy who had decided something and was going to see it through. He came back in 1954 with a knee that would ache for the rest of his life and a quietness that his mother recognized immediately as the thing that happened to boys who had seen what boys should not have to see. She never asked him about it directly. She just made sure there was always a plate ready when he came home, and she sat across from him at the table and talked about ordinary things until the quietness eased. He married Dorothy Louise Freeman, in 1958 a schoolteacher, from Augusta, who had the sharpest mind and the warmest laugh of anyone he had ever met. They had 3 children, a son named Charles, a daughter named Patricia, and a second daughter named Ruth, who came along in 1965, and who Harold always said was the one most like her mother. He meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Harold and Dorothy had 51 years together. He drove her to chemotherapy every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years without being asked, and without making it seem like a sacrifice, because to him it was not a sacrifice. It was simply the next thing that needed doing for the person he had promised to show up for. Dorothy passed in 2009. Harold continued to set 2 coffee cups out on the kitchen counter every morning for 4 months, before he noticed he was doing it, and then he continued doing it for another 2 months because stopping felt like a different kind of loss. He eventually stopped. He rearranged the kitchen. He learned to make his own doctor's appointments. He learned to eat dinner at 5 o'clock and to sleep on his own side of the bed and to talk to Dorothy in the quiet moments of the day, the way you talk to someone who is no longer in the room, but has not quite left either. His 3 children were good to him in the ways that adult children are good to aging parents. When they live in different cities and have their own obligations and love their father deeply but cannot always translate that love into presence. Charles was in Phoenix. Patricia was in Charlotte. Ruth, the one most like her mother, was in Chicago, where she had lived for 20 years and where she had built the kind of life Dorothy would have been profoundly proud of. They called. They visited at Christmas and sometimes Thanksgiving. They called more after Dorothy died, and the calls gradually settled back to once a week, which was enough for Harold because he told them it was enough and he meant it mostly. What Harold did not tell them, what he would not have known how to say even if he had wanted to, was that the hardest part was not the silence in the house. He had made a kind of peace with that. The hardest part was the accumulation of small moments that had nobody to share them with. The cardinal that came to the feeder every morning at exactly 7:15. The particular way the light fell across his back porch on October afternoons. The joke he thought of during the evening news that had nobody to receive it. These were not griefs. They were just the uncollected small change of a long life, and they accumulated in a way that had no name and that Harold, being Harold, would never have thought to mention. His granddaughter, Alicia, Ruth's daughter, 29 years old, a physical therapist in Atlanta who had moved there 3 years ago specifically to be closer to her grandfather. A fact she mentioned casually and that Harold took as a gift of enormous proportions, had entered the family into the Family Feud casting pool 8 months earlier. She had told Harold it would be fun, an adventure, something to do. Harold had said he was not sure a man his age had any business on a game show. Alicia had said he was the sharpest person she knew when they were going, and Harold had known from the tone of it that the decision had already been made. What Alicia had not told Harold, what she had spent 6 weeks coordinating with production staff, airline schedules, and two people Harold had not seen in 7 years, was the rest of the plan. The Watkins family came to the studio on a Tuesday in February. Harold, Alicia, Alicia's husband David, and two of Harold's great-grandchildren, Marisol, who was 11, and Theo, who was 8, and had spent the entire drive to the studio asking questions about how television cameras worked. Harold had answered every question with the patience of a man who had been answering children's questions for 60 years, and had never once found the practice tedious. They were a compact, warm unit. Harold wore a dark blue suit that he had owned for 15 years and maintained impeccably. With a white pocket square that Dorothy had given him and that he still used on occasions he considered significant. He had decided, without telling anyone, that being on television qualified. The opposing family, the Jefferson family from Nashville, were 4 generations as well. A grandmother in her 60s, 2 adult grandchildren, and a teenage great-granddaughter who immediately fell into whispered conversation with Marisol. Backstage, Harold watched this happen and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent enough time on Earth to recognize small goodnesses when they occur. The game began and Harold was, from the first moment, exactly himself. Measured, precise, occasionally and perfectly dry. When Steve Harvey asked him the opening face-off question, name something a person does first thing in the morning, Harold considered it for exactly 2 seconds and said, check if you're still here. The studio exploded. Steve Harvey bent double, laughing. Harold waited for the noise to subside with the expression of a man who has made a joke and considers the laughter its own reward. Sir, Steve said, straightening up and pointing at Harold with genuine delight. You are G. Owing to be trouble today. I'm 88, Harold said. I've earned it. The audience loved him unreservedly. The Watkins family played with confidence and warmth, Harold anchoring the team with a steadiness that drew spontaneous applause. Between rounds, Steve worked his way through the family with his usual ease, drawing out stories, finding the texture of their lives. When he reached Harold, he slowed down in the way he had in the previous episode, dramatically, but with a particular intentionality that the cameras were already close enough to register. Mr. Watkins, Steve said, 88 years old. What does that feel like from the inside? Harold considered the question. Like being the last one at the party, he said. The music's still good. You're just aware there are fewer people left to dance with. The audience went quiet in the way they go quiet when something true has been said in language they were not expecting. Steve held Harold's gaze. Do you feel that you've lost your dance partners? I've lost some, Harold said. He said it without self-pity, just plainly as a fact. My wife, a few good friends, you adjust. That's what you do. He paused. But I won't pretend it isn't quiet sometimes. Steve nodded. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, if you could have one person back in the room, who would it be? Harold did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands for a moment, the hands of a man who had worked with them for 88 years, who had built things and repaired things and held his dying wife's hands and carried his grandchildren and clapped at school plays and shaken the hands of presidents and privates alike. My son Charles, he said finally, we had a falling out 7 years ago. It was about something foolish, the way the worst ones always are. I've written him letters I didn't send. I've picked up the phone and put it down. He exhaled slowly. At 88, you start to understand that time is the one thing you cannot replenish. I'd want Charles back in the room. The studio was completely silent. Alicia, standing at her position at the podium, had tears running down her face. She was pressing her lips together. David had his hand on her back. The two great-grandchildren were very still, sensing without understanding that something adult and important was happening around them. Steve Harvey looked at Harold Watkins for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded card. A small, deliberate gesture that the cameras caught from 3 angles simultaneously. He held it without opening it. He looked at Harold. Mr. Watkins, he said, I need to ask you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me. Harold looked back at him with the clear, unfrightened eyes of a man who has already lived through most of the things there are to be afraid of. "All right," he said. "I need you to look at the audience," Steve said. "Really look. Take your time." Harold turned toward the audience. He scanned the rows slowly, the way a man looks when he is not sure what he is looking for but has decided to look carefully anyway. The audience sat absolutely still. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. Several people were visibly crying, though Harold could not have known why. He turned back to Steve. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for," he said. Steve Harvey said, "Look again. Third row center." Harold turned back to the audience. He found the third row. He found the center. And there, sitting very still in a gray suit, with his hands on his knees and his eyes fixed on his father with an expression that had not moved in several minutes, was Charles Watkins, 61 years old, Harold's son, the person he had written letters to and not sent, the person he had picked up the phone for and put it down. Harold did not move for a moment. He simply looked. Charles stood up slowly from his box seat. Harold's hand went out to the edge of the podium. Not for support, exactly, but the way a person reaches for something solid when the ground beneath them is shifted. He straightened. He was 88 years old, and he straightened his back in the way his mother had taught him to carry himself, and he stepped away from the podium and walked carefully, with the measured pace his knee required, toward the front of the stage. Charles met him at the stairs. He came up onto the stage, and they stood face to face for the first time in 7 years, and neither of them spoke. Charles was the one who moved first. He put his arms around his father, the way a grown son holds an old man carefully, aware of the fragility, and also with a force that came from 7 years of withheld presence. Harold's arms came up around his son's back, and he held on. The studio rose, all of it. At once, without anyone leading it, people simply got to their feet because sitting felt wrong for what they were witnessing. Steve Harvey stood at the center of the stage and made no move to speak. He stood with both hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly bowed, watching two men reclaim 7 years of lost time and the only currency that matters: the physical fact of being in the same room. After a long moment, Harold pulled back and looked at his son's face. He raised one hand and put it briefly against Charles's cheek, the way parents touch their children when they are checking that they are real. "You look older," Harold said. Charles laughed despite himself. "Dad, I'm allowed," Harold said. "I'm 88. The audience laughed and cried simultaneously. Steve Harvey pressed two fingers to his lips and did not attempt to speak. Charles put his hand on his father's shoulder. "I got your letters," he said quietly. Harold was still for a moment. "I didn't send any letters." "Alicia sent them," Charles said. "All of them. About 6 months ago. She found them in your desk drawer, and she mailed every single one." Harold absorbed this. He turned slowly to look at Alicia at the podium. Alicia, whose face was entirely wet, gave her grandfather a small, unrepentant shrug. "She had no right to do that," Harold said. "No," Charles agreed. "She did the right thing," Harold said. "Yes," Charles said, "she really did." Steve Harvey found his voice. He spoke quietly, without the performance of a television host, just a man saying the thing that needed saying. "Mr. Watkins, I want to tell you something. In the years I have stood on this stage, I have seen a lot of things. I have seen people win money, and I have seen people lose. I have seen people cry, and I have seen people laugh until I couldn't stand. But I have never, not once, seen something as simple and as necessary as what just happened here. A man told the truth about missing his son, and his family made sure the son heard it." He stopped for a moment. "That is what love looks like when it decides to stop waiting." He turned to address the audience and the cameras. "There are people watching this right now who have a letter they haven't sent, a phone call they haven't made, someone they miss and have told themselves it's too late for. I want to say something to those people directly. It is not too late. Harold Watkins is 88 years old, and it was not too late. Whatever you're waiting for, a better moment, more courage, the right words. I am telling you from this stage right now, the moment is today, the courage is enough. And the words don't have to be right, they just have to be sent." The episode aired 5 weeks later. The clip of Harold reaching for the edge of the podium, straightening his back, and walking toward his son covered every major platform within hours. By the end of the first day, it had been seen by 90 million people. By the end of the week, the number had passed 250 million. Grief counselors and family therapy, STS, shared it with their clients. Veterans organizations cited it in their newsletters. Estrangement support groups, a quiet, significant corner of the internet populated by people carrying exactly the weight Harold had described shared it so widely that it became, for a period of weeks, the most discussed topic on several of their forums. The phrase Steve Harvey had used, "love deciding to stop waiting," was quoted more than any single line from the episode, including Harold's joke about still being here. It appeared on social media, in opinion columns, in a sermon delivered at a church in rural Mississippi that someone filmed and uploaded and, which itself was watched 2 million times. But the broadcast, again, was only the surface of the story. Charles Watkins had flown from Phoenix to Atlanta. He stayed for 4 days. On the first evening, he and Harold sat on the back porch of Alicia's house until 11 at night and talked with the thoroughness that 7 years of silence requires. They covered the argument which had been, as Harold had said, about something foolish. A disagreement over the handling of Dorothy's estate that had calcified into something harder than rough either of them had intended. They covered the letters Harold had written and not sent, which Charles had read in one sitting on the night they arrived, in the kitchen of his Phoenix apartment, and which had kept him up until 4 in the morning. They covered Dorothy, the way two people who love the same woman cover her when they are finally in the same room, with the tenderness and the humor and the specific gravity that belongs to shared grief. At some point, Alicia brought out coffee and then quietly retreated because she understood, with the instinct of someone who has always understood people, that this was not a conversation that needed an audience. When she checked on them an hour later, they had stopped talking and were simply sitting in the same comfortable silence of men who have resolved something and no longer need to fill the air. Charles extended his stay by 3 days. He and Harold drove to Macon, Harold's birthplace, a city Charles had visited only once as a child, and walked the street where Harold had grown up. The house was a parking lot now, which Harold looked at for a long moment and then said was probably an improvement on what it had been. Charles laughed and Harold smiled, and they drove to a diner and had lunch and split a piece of peach pie and talked about Harold's mother, who Charles had never known well, and about what it had been like to be 17 and lying about your age in a recruitment office. "Were you scared?" Charles asked. "Terrified," Harold said, "but being terrified never stopped anything from being necessary." Charles thought about that for a long time on the drive back to Atlanta. Patricia, the middle child, called Harold the night the episode aired. She had seen it live, alone in her house in Charlotte, and she called at 9 in the evening and cried on the phone in a way Harold found simultaneously uncomfortable and deeply right. Ruth called from Chicago. She told Harold she was coming for his birthday in April, whether he wanted her to or not. Harold said he supposed that was fine. Ruth knew from his voice that it was more than fine. The show's follow-up segment aired 4 months later. It showed Harold's 89th birthday celebration, a gathering at Alicia's house in Atlanta that had drawn, by the time it happened, all 3 of Harold's children, 4 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren, the largest assembly of the Watkins family in over a decade. Charles was there. He had driven from Phoenix. He had also quietly transferred his annual leave so that it was concentrated in winter and spring, which Alicia understood immediately and appreciated without commenting on. The footage showed Harold at the head of the table, surrounded by the kind of density of family he had not sat inside since Dorothy was alive. He was wearing the same dark blue suit with the white pocket square. He looked, to everyone watching, like a man who has received something he did not allow himself to expect. Steve Harvey narrated the segment in voiceover, and the line he chose to open with became the one that stayed. "Last February, an 88-year-old man told us he was aware that there were fewer people left to dance with. He was wrong. He just didn't know yet who was still in the room." Harold watched the segment when it aired, sitting in Alicia's living room with Alicia and David and the 2 great-grandchildren. When it ended, Marisol, the 11-year-old, leaned against him and asked why he was crying. "I'm not crying," Harold said. "Pop, pop," Marisol said, with the frank authority of 11-year-olds everywhere. "You are absolutely crying." Harold put his arm around her. "All right," he said, "maybe a little." He had written Charles a letter after the taping. A real one, this time, with a stamp that he handed directly to Charles before he boarded his flight back to Phoenix. He did not tell anyone what was in it. Charles, when asked by his own children what the letter said, told them it was private. What he would say, and what he has said in the years since, is that it was the most important piece of mail he has ever received and that he keeps it in the top drawer of his desk and takes it out occasionally when he needs to be reminded of something. He has never specified what the something is. He does not need to. The people who watched Harold Watkins walk across that stage toward his son already know. Harold turned 90 the following April. He is still in Macon. No, still in his house in Georgia. the one he and Dorothy bought in 1972, and that he has maintained with the same impeccable care he brings to everything. He still sets out one coffee cup in the morning. Though on the mornings when Charles is visiting, which is more often now, 4 or 5 times a year, he sets out two. He still wears the white pocket square on significant occasions. He still mows his own lawn, though Charles has quietly arranged for a neighbor's teenager to come by afterward and do the edges, a compromise that Harold has chosen not to acknowledge, and therefore, tacitly accepted. The Cardinal still comes to the feeder at 7:15. Harold still notices the light on October afternoons. The jokes still come to him during the evening news. The difference is that now, most evenings, he picks up the phone and makes a call, not because his family has asked him to, not because the television appearance changed him in any fundamental way, because Harold Watkins at 90 is recognizably the same man he was at 88, but because the appearance reminded him of something he had known his whole life and briefly, in the quiet years, let himself forget that presence is not a burden, it is the thing. Steve Harvey was asked in a profile interview last year which moment in his hosting career he returned to most often. He did not answer immediately. He described Harold straightening his back before walking to the stairs. He described the way Harold had said his son's name was the one dance he wanted back, without any expectation that the dance could be restored. He described the particular quality of the silence in the room. When Charles stood up in the third row, "I have been in rooms full of people for most of my adult life," he said. "I know what a room sounds like when something real is happening in it. That room was the quietest I have ever heard. And the reason it was so quiet is that everyone in it, for everyone watching, everyone who has watched since, recognized something. They recognized that moment when you realize you still have time, when you realize that the door you thought had closed is still there, still openable, and that you are still standing close enough to walk through it." He paused. Harold Watkins W. walked through it. And I think for a lot of people, watching him do it gave them permission to walk through their own.